Good evening, friends. Thank you for joining today's webinar. This is 15th lecture in this series on mapping sustainable agriculture, which India International Center is hosting, and I am curating the same. The first lecture in this series was delivered by Dr. Ashok Gulati, and after that we have had several eminent speakers who have spoken on various aspects of Indian agriculture. We had Mr. Kiran Vissa, who spoke on tenant farmers. Then we had Professor Sukhpal Singh of IIM Ahmedabad on reforming the agricultural markets, but that was before the three farm laws were enacted by the government. Then we had Mr. Shiv Kumar from ITC, we had Kavita Kulgranti from ASHA, and after that on WTO related issues, we had Sachin Sharma from IIFT, and we also had Mr. Harveer Singh from media, how agriculture is treated by the media, and so on. So I'm really happy to welcome Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy. Many of you would know her already. She's a well-known name in agriculture, especially in agriculture marketing. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, and she's also the director of the State Capacity Initiative there. She has done her PhD from London University in Sociology and Anthropology, but she has spent a lot of time, more than a decade, doing fieldwork in mundis. As you know, friends, the APMCs and the mundis have earned a very bad name in the last 2 years since the enactment of these laws through an ordinance in June of 2020. Now, a lot of media reports suggested that APMCs are the real culprits and the farmers are only exploited by the APMCs. There is hardly any benefit which is brought to the farmers by the APMCs and so on. In collaboration with the Center for Advanced Studies, University of Pennsylvania, she has done a very detailed study. She'll be talking about that of agricultural markets in Odisha, Bihar, and Punjab. So she is the most appropriate person to speak about the agricultural marketing, what are the alternatives available, how should APMCs be reformed, and is there a future of agriculture marketing in India without APMCs? So I request Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy to take over from here and speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. And after that, we will have questions. Friends, if you have any questions, you can please type the same in the chat box or in the question box. Over to you, Mekhala.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hussain. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this wonderful series, I think, which has brought so much attention, but also so many diverse perspectives on agriculture and the challenges that lie ahead. So it's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my work and to discuss these really difficult issues with all of you. I'm now going to share my screen and then get started. Is this visible? Yeah. Okay. So, today I decided to title this particular talk, and after discussing with you, agricultural market diversity and integration, implications for policy. Part of the impulse for this is, as you mentioned, over the last 2 years, there have been a number of us who have been pointing to the fact that when you come up with a central law and a central policy, that we have to understand the diversity and complexity of Indian markets. But we get a lot of so what, right at the beginning. And as an anthropologist and a sociologist, one tends to think that you have some sort of almost a fetish of diversity, that you need to show how different everything is. And so some of the common critiques that we hear is that, look, India is diverse. This is India, and India is diverse, right? Everything is around diversity. And, we are like this only. So what is the big deal with diversity? The second thing that one often hears is that diversity and complexity are used to critique policy, but they're not really constructive. So whenever one wants to say that a policy has limitations or uniformity won't work, we say things are diverse and complex, but really this is not a very constructive place to be. And at best, this is a matter of curiosity and fascination, but it's not really consequential. So that diversity is curious, but not consequential. those who believe that there is some value in talking about diversity and thinking about diversity, think about it in terms of, diversity is all very good at decentralized scales, at small scale, but it really doesn't work when what you need are large scale solutions. And you also have the view that diversity actually enables fragmentation. So if you have too much diversity, you will have fragmentation, and this will impede integration. And most recently, and partly this is because of the words, diversity is also tied up with diversification. So people assume that there's a very close relationship between market diversity and diversification. I would like to use the next, half an hour to make the case that diversity matters. And it matters not because, this is merely descriptive. Right. So the first is that agricultural markets, and people who work in agricultural markets know this, empirical specification is actually a general requirement to understand markets. If you're a farmer, you don't just say beej or seed, you know which beej, you know which fertilizer, you know the amount of water, you know when water is coming. Agriculture is a very specific business. Similarly with price, a price is never just a price. A price is at a fair average quality. It is usually accompanied with a specification. This price for this quality. So people in markets, in agriculture, on the field and in markets, very rarely talk in generalizations. Once you get past policy description, everybody is always talking about very specific terms. So in the practice of agriculture, specification is just part of everyday business. But more than that, market diversity, when I talk about it, is not just a descriptive thing. It is actually about the variations that exist in market structure, in market organization, in market processes and market relations. And it is about the interactions between all of this and the changes over time. So we are not being vague about diversity. Everything is about diversity. Things are different. We are being, quite clear about what are we trying to look at variations around. And the other thing that you realize once you start looking at these questions of structure and organization is that you cannot very easily separate production, exchange, processing, distribution, and consumption. So marketing, which is really in the exchange realm, is deeply tied up with production and with processing, distribution, and consumption. And it's not easy to separate them out. For policy, I would like to suggest that if you take market diversity seriously, there are some big changes that happen. We move from assumptions about how agricultural markets and state intervention works to an understanding of how they work in practice. So the move from assumptions to understanding. Secondly, even though we are dealing with diversity, it is only when you look at many different kinds of sites that you also start to get a better sense of common characteristics. The way various common relationships, for example, the relationship between credit and commodity marketing, how does it actually work in context? You start seeing variations and you also start creating a sense of typologies, right? So you can, only when you see many, many sites can you do that. It also makes you pay attention to preconditions. Many times for policy, we don't pay attention to the preconditions that are required for certain policies to work. And when you study market diversity in different sites, you pay attention to the preconditions that are required, to some common principles, but different mechanisms and approaches that have been tried or may be tried. And you get a much better grip of the potentials and limitations of various kinds of strategies. Finally, the last three things I want to say is that you move then, once you do all this, you move from policy prescription to policy frameworks, to having a more comprehensive framework for policy making, and you start thinking about transition pathways. This is something I think, Mr. Hussain, you yourself have written so much about, that you need to shift the thinking to pathways of transition, and that these are processes. So only when you engage with this kind of diversity do you start shifting the thing from prescription to frameworks. And this will force you to be both more comprehensive and more contextual. Right? So contrary to thinking about things as fragmented, the more you engage with diversity, the more you actually engage with a sense of comprehensiveness. And integration actually requires more coordination rather than uniformity. It is not uniformity per se, but actually a greater kind of coordination that is required, but also that integration has its own consequences. Right. So, I mean, very briefly, I have been learning, as was said in the introduction, about agricultural markets extensively over the last 10, 12 years, reading a lot and learning from existing data, reporting, research, and scholarship. There are not a lot of people who work deeply on agricultural markets. It's very surprising given how important they are. The scholarship remains relatively limited, but there are a few who have really stayed with this over many years. In the world of media and reporting, there are journalists like Harish Damodaran who have studied this for a long time. But in the world of scholarship, scholars like Barbara Harris-White have really engaged with these over a long time. I've learned a lot reading and engaging with their work. I myself conducted long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Madhya Pradesh. That's where I began with my doctoral research. Then I did a comparative research project looking at Bihar, Karnataka, and MP, which was also based out of Kasi at UPenn in partnership with IIM Bangalore, and also the anthropologist Jeff Witso, who had worked in Bihar. And then most recently, the Kasi Agricultural Markets Project, which has studied Bihar, Odisha, and Punjab, where my co-authors and collaborators are Shumitra Chatterjee, Devesh Kapoor, Marshall Bouton, and we had an amazing team of field researchers who were on the ground in 7 districts across these states. And then there was in all of this, what one has tried to do is study markets across states, districts, commodity systems, and over time, right? So we are not looking at it at one point in time. Before I leap in, I just want to pause for a second and talk about concepts and definitions. We use these terms very loosely, without having a good understanding of what they are specifically. So we use the term markets for everything, but there is an economic market, there's production, marketing, processing and consumption, exchange, circulation, distribution, but we often do not make enough distinction between spot and futures markets, physical and electronic markets, primary, secondary, and tertiary markets, wholesale and retail markets organized on very different principles. The difference between markets and sites of exchange, market sites, and marketplaces. And in this, when the laws came up, there was a lot of confusion between trade area and market area. So there are legal definitions, and then there are actual sites of exchange. They are both regulated and unregulated. Buyers and sellers, principals, agents, processors, logistics operators, and then, so we tend not to pay attention to all of this. And it's all of this that goes into the making and configuring of market systems, agricultural market systems. So let's just think a little bit about variation here, just for all of us to look at some of the ways in which variation works itself out. So often you will find that there's a same region, but there are different commodities. Different commodities are sold in the same market site, but they are sold through different market systems and processes. So this was the case in Madhya Pradesh with soybean and wheat. Both soybean and wheat came into Harda Mandi. They both came into mandis, but one was sold in an open outcry auction, bought largely by traders. And after 2008 and 9, you started seeing wheat largely was bought without an auction, because the wheat that came to the mandi was procured by the state at MSP. So you actually saw one had an auction, the other didn't have an auction. One was sold largely to private traders. After 2008 and 9, most wheat was bought by the state. But if if wheat came to the same mandi, not in April, May, and June, but came in, say, had been held over and came later in September, it was sold in an open outcry auction, right? So the same commodity can also be sold in the same mandi through 2 different processes. And you'll also see this with variety changes, right? So when we talk about commodities, we often don't pay attention enough to varieties. Basmati and non-basmati paddy are completely different commodities, and different varieties of wheat also, milk quality and, say, Sharbati and Sihor, very different kinds of commodities themselves. Then you have the same region with different commodities, different market sites and systems. So this was if you looked at fruits and vegetables in Harda or in any other, most of the other markets we've seen, the soybean and wheat would come to the mundi. Fruits and vegetables often were sold in other market sites outside of the mundi, or they had their own mundi, which is a slightly different marketing site altogether, not slightly, quite completely different, and organized differently in terms of spatial, infrastructural arrangements, etc. They also worked at completely different times of the day. Then you have the same commodity in different regions, different market sites and systems. This we saw very clearly with paddy in our research, right? So you have one commodity paddy, but you look at different regions and different market sites, and you see very different systems and sites. The same region, there's the same commodity, different sub-region, different market sites and systems. Now here, in Sambalpur and Balasore in East and West MP, even in blocks within Harda, it was actually quite similar region. It's the same commodity, but we'll have different kinds of access to markets, different kinds of marketing sites, public infrastructure, the quality of mandis are different, the amount of procurement done by the state is different, and you will see quite a lot of variation. So in Sambalpur, there was a lot more paddy procurement than you saw in Balasore. And the reasons for that is actually a much more mobilized and stronger farmer community. And then finally, across the board in the same region, you will see different farmers, different traders having differential terms of engagement with markets, right? And there are different drivers of differentiation. Land size is obviously a major one, but different kinds of access to resources, membership in different sorts of collectives, different groups have access to the market in different ways, right? So both informal and formal arrangements, as well as basic core asset distribution, will affect how your access to markets is, including things like irrigation, where you take your credit systems from, etc. So just to give you all a sense of the sites, sorry, I'm just gonna, yeah. So we'll run through a few images. This is Harda Mandi. These are small farmers selling their produce in bags. Larger traders come, larger farmers come in tractor trolleys laden with their crops. Some of the smaller farmers will actually on rent per bag their way. This is a soybean auction where the traders are actually sampling. In the case of wheat procurement, there was no need for an auction because everything was being sold to the government, so it would come in and be sold straight. And so you didn't have to stand in an auction. You would just get a parchi and you would move to deposits. This is again from wheat procurement season. Here's just an example of regional variation. This was a mapping of the distribution of APMCs. The larger circles are A-class mandis, the large dark blue ones. And you can see they are concentrated in this Malwa region, in the central parts of MP. But as you move to the eastern parts of MP and you see the extreme western district as well, and in the north you're seeing far fewer. So some districts, as you can see, don't have any A-class mandis at all. Some barely have one or two, even C or D-class mandis, right? So there's a spatial variation in the distribution and the construction of markets. This is the point we were making about very different kinds of marketing systems for the same commodity. I'm now just going to show you procurement networks and commodity networks just for paddy in Bihar. This is from our research in the CASI Agricultural Markets Project. So this is Bihar paddy. This is Balasore in Odisha, right? You see a very different thing. Bihar, the vast majority of the paddy will come to the village intermediary. Here, there's a village trader. There's also a paddy purchase center. It's a more dominant site. In Hoshiarpur, very, very different, right? This is what you would expect in a mandi in Punjab, a much, much less complex chain with really the state being the single buyer. But even within Odisha, Sambalpur has a lot more paddy purchase centers and paddy procurement than Koraput, right? Same commodity, but a lot more goes through the village trader. There is also a purchase center, but Sambalpur has a lot more that actually goes to the government. And in Koraput, the same district, ginger which is a commodity that is actually listed on ENAM, actually has a very different life. None of it was actually formally traded on ENAM at all, although it is listed there. The majority goes through this chain with aggregators, traders in hearts, commission agents in hearts, retailers in the district, but there are also a lot of traders outside the district and outside Odisha who come in. So this is again just to give you a visual sense of some of these changes, right? So this is a weekly heart in Sambalpur. It was earlier run by the Gram Panchayat. Then the Regulated Marketing Committee took it over a couple of years ago. There are sheds and platforms built by the RMC. There's a significant reduction in shop rents. This is Sambalpur, Odisha, but this is the market for chilies in Solbaga. In Kuchinda and Bamra blocks where red chilies are grown. There was a fall in production just around the time we had done field work. There was a lot of price volatility and crop disease. It really did not work on ENAM very much, and you can see in Sambalpur the red chilies, and in Koraput we had ginger. Okay, here in Nalanda, you have these potato sacks which are lined up for sale and the farmers in the farm, and the labor for packaging, loading, unloading was actually provided by the trader. So it was an incentive for farmers to sell at the farm gate. The sale of wheat at a farmer's household in Nalanda, you can see this, and this was a farmer who was able to negotiate prices. And it was a question about whether his marketing power changed or his ability to bargain in the mundi changed because of his socioeconomic position. This is Bihar Sharif Mandi at its peak in the early morning. This is Bihar Sharif Mandi at noon. Similarly, there are a whole range of assumptions that we have. I think I can just go back and quickly skipped over a particular slide here. We make some very common assumptions, right? So just to come back to this slide, we've seen some of this diversity. So clearly there are assumptions that APMC mandis are the dominant site of exchange, that regulatory restrictions are the primary barrier facing farmers and firms. What we're seeing just visibly is very different. That intermediaries are exploitative, inefficient, and make large margins. I'm going to come to that in a bit. That interlocked markets are the norm, that procurement is limited to Punjab and Haryana, and procurement systems are similar across states. So no matter how much we see this kind of diversity, the sorts of images, maps, diagrams that we are showing you here, these assumptions seem to persist in the way in which we characterize and think about markets. So if we just look at some of the data that we've been able to look at, this challenges this greatly. Firstly, we found across sites in, notably Punjab would be different, but really you're looking at 45 to 50% farmers who have marketable surplus. And not all commodities are sold in the market. Some commodities are still very much part of both food and fodder security arrangements of farmers. So the assumption again that all farmers sell is itself. When it comes to where do farmers sell, right? You can see in most of these sites, and certainly in Bihar and in Odisha, you're seeing the farm gate. And then for certain commodities in Odisha particularly, you're seeing hearts as very important sites, right? Mandis are relatively smaller sites, and they're sites for very particular kinds of commodities in certain places, but you're really seeing an overwhelming amount of produce sold at the farm gate. But look at Hoshiarpur, not at all surprising, the majority is sold in mandis, but even there you see certain amount of cereals, pulses, and oilseeds sold at the farm gate. But if you look at vegetables, again you see, the farm gate is high, but in a district like Koraput, you see the heart has become a dominant site for the sale of vegetables, right? So it's a different site that one has to look at. In Hoshiarpur, also for vegetables, the farm gate is quite important. Here we found for peas and a number of other types of produce that the farm gate was the place that you would actually see farmers sell. Again, the site of sale, we would assume, and I talked about differentiation, and we will see differentiation. You see that farmers are able to bargain more, and certainly in terms of bargaining power, they also sell more. Larger farmers have more marketable surplus, but the site of sale doesn't change all that much, which tells you something about the market system, that even large farmers are largely selling at the farm gate, right? And whether you're a large or small farmer, you're in the farm gate. Methods of weighing. Again, this is very important. Not enough attention is paid to weighment, but it's almost the opposite of what you would expect. Large, well-organized mandis like Hoshiarpur have manual weighing. You see a lot more electronic weighing scales. In most sites, Purnia was notable, and there was a lot of discussion about why there are manual weighing scales in Purnia and whether there is a trading off of high prices for weighment malpractices. So again, it's not a guarantee that because you have a large mandi with well-organized systems, you will have electronic weigh bridges. There is no reason why you could not have an electronic weigh bridge in Punjab's mandis, but you don't. Again, there are all kinds of assumptions that we make about how long it takes to get payment. And what we find here is that the small traders and intermediaries actually make payments very quickly. And it was in Hoshiarpur that there was the longest delay, and that a lot of that payment does come from the state and through the procurement process. But also very importantly here, the assumption is always that there are interlocked transactions, that you sell to the person you take money from. Artyas are creditors, and we didn't find this in Bihar, for example, at all. You see this very much a practice in Punjab still, where your artyas, our kacha artyas, they do give you credit in the lean season and at other times, and they do take your commodity. But this interlinking is not everywhere, and certainly you did not find this in Bihar. It wasn't the reason though that farmers didn't make it into the mandi. They weren't selling in the village because they were taking credit in the village. Right? So that would have been a mistaken assumption. The same thing was in Madhya Pradesh. If you went in the 1980s, when farmers in this area in Harda, where I worked, were cultivating cotton, they did take loans from the artyas. And there were credit relations. But by the time I started doing my research in 2008, there was very little borrowing from the traders in the mandi. The sites of credit had moved. Informal credit and formal credit, the arrival of KCCs, many other changes, but farmers were not borrowing from the mandi, right? Similarly, here you see with mode of payment, everywhere cash is predominantly the way in which people conduct these transactions, and Hoshiarpur is a notable difference where you see checks. But when you think about mobile money, we're talking about integrating markets, we're talking about access to digital payments, the penetration is extremely low, and this is very recent research. And finally, in paddy procurement, right, you're seeing very different systems. In Bihar, which has negligible procurement, Orissa, which has a well-established procurement system, but still many complexities in the way in which procurement happens through local area systems, through the packs. And again, in Madhya Pradesh, again, it happens through primary agricultural cooperative societies. So, these were these three sites, and you can add Madhya Pradesh, you can add Telangana, you will see very different systems and mechanisms of procurement for which the negotiating power of farmers are different, access is different, and a lot of where discretion is exercised is different. And in Punjab, of course, is the one we are most familiar with, where farmers sell through artyas. But the idea that farmers sell through artyas everywhere is simply not the case. Also, that you would have a universal procurement system like you do in Punjab and Haryana for paddy and wheat is simply not the case. In most other states, it is a limited procurement, both in terms of time and in terms of the amount that is bought in different sites. So having looked at all this, the question I want to then ask is, where do we find common ground, right? If there's all this diversity, what are we supposed to do? And I would actually argue that the diversity allows us to actually pay attention to the principles and purpose of policy and state intervention, right? The reason we should pay attention to diversity is not because policy is impossible or because public intervention shouldn't happen, but it allows us to actually think about the principles of intervention. So there are some lessons that we have learned and, over these years, and I'd like to just take a few minutes to focus on them. So when you think about regulation, the question is, what was the original thinking? Siraj started by saying that APMCs have got this terrible reputation now. And it's worth asking, why did we create them in the first place then? So what was the original thinking, and have the basic conditions for public regulation changed? The idea behind APMCs is a really important one, which was that these are markets where you have a very large number of sellers who are small, typically small farmer sellers, and a few buyers in any given location. And these are markets with well-known asymmetries of information, given the size and relative bargaining power of market knowledge. And so the idea was to build physical market sites, mandis, physical places, which were regulated public markets, because it was clear at the beginning that you could not regulate trade in every single village and every heart. So you picked a few key sites, which were going to be regulated primary markets, where you built the infrastructure, where you licensed traders, where you brought everybody together, and ideally you were supposed to do an open auction. Our data showed that across the board, auctions were very few and far between that you actually saw auctions. But the idea was that these would be sites of better price discovery. And Soumitra Chatterjee's work shows, through very careful empirical work, that mandis do make a difference, right, to the kinds of prices that people get, because they are public sites where they enable certain kinds of price discovery to occur. They are concentration of buyers and sellers in a particular place. So even if you have a well-functioning mandi and you sell outside of the mandi, you have a benchmark, right, to benchmark price. They are also important not only for price, but also for the non-price dimensions of markets. We showed here, some data. There's more data that we have on quality, but there's also how assaying is done, how sampling is actually done. But then there are also questions of weighment, which we've talked about, payment, how late you pay, how fully you pay, right? So timely and full settlement of payment. Every transaction of this kind, you have counterparty risk. This is something that farmers experience across the board, but when the farm laws were brought into place and trade moved out of mandis, there were many reports suddenly of farmers who had been defrauded by traders who came, bought a little bit, bought from a couple of farmers, paid them fully, and then absconded, right? And there was no mechanism in the act or in the new system to catch such traders. Whereas in the mandi, you're supposed to take advance. Sometimes you take advance fees and collection, and that's the way you have counterparty risk. You put deposits against your usual buying. So there are mechanisms for counterparty risk. And what we've learned is institutional design matters. And the implementation is dynamic. So the reason different states don't have mandis or have good quality mandis are very particular. They're particular to the agroecology of those states, the kinds of crops that are grown there. So if you have a very strong sugar system and sugarcane marketing, it's a very different thing. It's anyway out of mandis. It has a very different system. So like you would have, say, in UP or in Maharashtra. So the agroecology, the political economy is very different in different states. States make decisions at various times. So Kerala's decision not to have mandis is very different from Bihar's decision in 2006. Kerala had a system of commodity boards because most of its crops were plantation crops. So these are very particular institutional dynamics that we have to pay attention to, but they also change with trade dynamics and with technological change. One of the big factors that integrated mandis in terms of price was first the arrival of the telephone and then the cell phone. You do see these changes occur at various points. New sampling systems, the ability, certainly in dairy, the technological ability to sample was very important to changing the way in which dairy markets are organized. When you study a single mandi over time, you see that mandis do better and worse. It's not like they're consigned to be hellholes forever. I've seen really poorly performing mandis improve, become better mandis where price discovery is done better, auctions are improved, infrastructure is improved, and then they also deteriorate. Right? This is also true of cooperatives, FPOs, they're institutions. So depending on how various interests and stakeholders engage with mandis, you do see change, you see reform, you see resistance. And with the arrival of multiple sites and channels in a state like Madhya Pradesh, you actually saw mandis improve even further, and you saw competition, but they also provided a very important check and balance to the private system. They provided farmers with those benchmarks. And when the private traders went away and didn't buy, the mandi was there as an important site, right? So there's a big difference between having multiple sites and channels and deregulation. The second thing I think that we have learned is that there's a scope and limitation of regulation itself, right? That we have to understand the interactions between production, consumption, and then markets in the middle. And we have seen that market power and competition is there in both regulated and unregulated markets. So the question is, how good can your regulation be, right? We have regulated markets where there are very few buyers, and you can see cartelization in mandis that have occurred. But we also saw cartelizations in the chili syndicate in Balasore and in markets which were very unregulated, where farmers wanted a mandi, right? They wanted a formal mandi because they were at the hands of intermediaries, right? So that's a very different system there. The terms of engagement in markets are actually responsive to changing conditions of production and consumption. So unfortunately, we focus a lot on disintermediation. We focus too much as a policy goal on disintermediation rather than strengthening the terms of engagement, without understanding the very important role that intermediaries continue to play. And if they weren't playing those roles and the markets improve, they will change and shift. So Madhya Pradesh actually did get, abolish the Kachadat Pratha in the 1980s, very differently from Punjab and Haryana, at a time when production conditions were changing. Farmers were shifting their crop from cotton to soybean. Areas were going from unirrigated to irrigated. At the same time, the government brought an oilseeds mission. It brought oil fed, other kinds of competition. Private markets also thrived. Mandis were, invested in, and you saw this kind of shift. And actually, they delinked credit and commodity marketing in these mandis. When I was there in 2008, about 15 years afterwards, they tried to do exactly the same thing, textbook same thing. Put the artiyas out of the sabzi mandi in the local town, move them into the market, and the artiyas returned in 15 days. Because the mandi system just could not adapt to fresh fruits and vegetables. But also, very importantly, artiyas were not only creditors to farmers, they were actually also creditors to the small vendors who bought and sold it and then paid off the next day. So they were also very important creditors on the other side. And they had the ability to keep the produce moving. So as one artiya there said, what is the khasiyat or the thing of sabzi, right? He said, kachi nahi bikti hai aur pakki nahi rukhti hai. So between this perishability is where I function, right? So this is again, same policy, different markets won't work. Finally, we have seen very much that public investment in infrastructure and institutions is critical to strengthening the terms of engagement of farmers. It also is critical to allowing new traders and new intermediaries and new firms to enter markets. So it is not just that you have to do regulation or deregulation, but actually public investment strengthens the overall ecosystem, right? And that farmers face multiple risks. And so these risks need different strategies and interventions. We can talk more about those in detail. And finally, I just want to make one last concluding point, that market diversity of this kind does not necessarily mean fragmentation. We saw that markets, even in the markets that we were sharing with you in Koraput, traders were coming from other parts of India. We have always had physical markets where there are remarkable feats of coordination that occur. But location does matter. Remoteness is a problem. We have seen in many of our researches, and I think the government's own documents have shown this, that something like ENAM in its current form is an app without a platform, because the platform has to be the existing mandi system, and that has been weakened. So unless you have a good system of physical markets, electronic markets won't work. And as we have seen in ENAM, inter-mandi trade is very, very low. And we saw this in Karnataka also, where they linked all their mandis. Inter-mandi trade was low, and interstate trade remains very elusive on these platforms. And yet farmers buy on behalf of distant buyers, both exporters as well as domestic buyers. Traders, intermediaries buy on behalf of buyers all over the place. and we see commodity moving. So if you look at your own fridges and you look at your own storage, you'll see many commodities are not coming from local areas. How are they moving? And then finally, the truth is that, and again, Shumitra's research has shown this, integration creates winners and losers, promotes specialization, it transmits more volatility. So if you want to do integration, you have to take precautions as well, right? It's not just a simple game. And these also are the dilemmas of diversification. So it promotes specialization on the one hand, more integration needs more specialization, but we want more diversification for agroecological reasons and for food security reasons. And there are real dilemmas in terms of diversification and scale. So finally, actually, if you want to take this seriously and think about what our farmers need and what would be a better agricultural market system and better agriculture for India, we need a much more comprehensive framework.
Battery khatam ho rahi hai.
And that is both more contextual. So it needs to be comprehensive and more contextual. And you need coordinated decision-making and implementation. You need transition pathways so that states can actually veer towards them. And that's actually going to need more center state, more interstate, and more interstate coordination. So it's not as if you can do all of this without coordination. And you need the right level of decentralized decision-making in the system. Certain decisions will only be best made by people who are running local markets. But the framework does not have to be one of local fragmented systems. In fact, the framework requires thinking at multiple levels where there's much greater coordination. I'll stop here and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mekhala. That is great. I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions, but unfortunately, my Zoom seems to have crashed and I cannot see any questions. So on behalf of the audience, I will ask you questions because
I can see a couple of questions here.
Okay, then you take it up first.
I can take this. They're just a couple, and then after that, I can turn to you for your questions. So the first one is actually about corruption in APMCs, and also any idea about the total production contributed by 45 having marketable surplus. So on the question of the total production, one would have to look, and it, I don't have a full answer for you in terms of the numbers, but you would have to look from depending on commodities, because you'll actually see it's again very commodity specific. The marketable surplus also is very different by commodities. And so if you're looking at the size of the market, there are a whole range of different estimates about the full size of how much agricultural produce is traded. But I would actually think you would have to look commodity wise to understand how much is sold, and you'll see quite a lot of variation. So like in a place like Punjab and Haryana, you'll see a lot of wheat and paddy, literally all of it coming to the mundi, but you won't see, and even in Punjab and Haryana, you'll see more paddy coming to the mundi than you will see wheat, where people still retain for home consumption. On the question of corruption in APMCs, without a doubt, there is corruption in APMCs. So one depends on which APMC you're looking at. And, for example, in Hadda in the 1980s, the APMC was very much controlled by major traders. And all the appointments of functionaries and others were made by the largest trader in the Mandi, the Nagar Seth, who made all the appointments, decided various things, and ran the APMC effectively. But this changed in the mid-1980s for a number of reasons. First, the state government actually brought in better regulation into these mandis. They brought in better secretaries, they filled the posts, they created actually a much more high capacity mandi system. They also, interestingly, then suspended mandi committees for a period of 10 years while they did a whole range of other kinds of investments in markets. And when you came back, by the late 80s and late 90s, in the same mandi, it was a farmer who actually ran on an independent, a farmer leader who became the mandi adhyaksh. This completely changed the dynamics in the mandi committee. This was the time Hadda got an electronic weighbridge. The mandi dynamics changed completely. The mandi platform changed. These same these same mandi functionaries who had all served the traders and still had good relationships with him, no longer helped him in the same way. They started showing up for work. They started running the auction in a certain way. Things changed. Similarly, as you know, I have stories of traders, where in the old days, they used to give the telephone operator one bag of moong and tell them, do not give that information about what is happening in chana markets till the end of the day to other traders, right? Once the mobile phones came, they said those were not things that we could do, right? Corruption continued to be a problem, both with, in the committee level and amongst traders. It's not like it's missing, right? But as the mandi became more vigilant, as farmers started demanding, I've actually said this many times to many of the civil society groups also, that why don't you do mandi audits? You do social audits of many other institutions, but if communities get involved, if farmers are strong and vigilant, you'll see a very different dynamic in mandis. So the old mandi inspector then once told me, he said, in a mandi, if you want to see how strong farmers are, look at the floor and see how much grain has been spilt. And in Harda, if you had gone in the 80s and 90s, it was a mandi full of spilt grain. By the 2000s, 2005, 2008, this was a very vyavasthit mandi. Right? Did that mean that corruption disappeared? No. Sometimes construction means more corruption. They will build and take, everybody took a certain hissa here and there. But that did not mean that you didn't see a changing balance of power. And so I think both when you look at cooperatives, when you look at mandis, when you look at a whole range of public institutions, the fact that they can be well governed and poorly governed is well known. The question is why? And ultimately, this requires a combination of various stakeholders to take the mandi seriously. It took farmers in Harda to get irrigation, to have 2 crops, to not be indebted to traders, to start, exercising their rights in a certain way. When competition came, the mandi also sorted out its own practices. So when ITC came and its chopals were set up, you started seeing mandi practice improve. But like I said, the fact that the mandi was there was very important because ITC didn't buy throughout the year, whereas the mandi was a multi-commodity, multi-season, all year round, multi-buyer market. So there's a difference between a procurement hub, whether that is a government procurement hub or a private procurement hub, and a mandi. Right? In Punjab, the mandis are, in wheat and paddy season are not mandis.
Yeah. Can I interrupt you?
Yes, yes, yes.
So I think you have answered it in quite a detail, and I'm sure the questioner has understood. I have a few questions. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, please.
Kerala does not have APMC, never had APMC. So is there any study about Kerala? Are the Kerala farmers suffering, or they are not suffering because Kerala is basically a shortage economy, and therefore the Kerala farmers are able to get good prices? What is your understanding of Kerala markets?
Yeah, so I won't hazard too long or too detailed an answer because I haven't studied Kerala's markets in detail. There is limited literature. There is some, but the kind of detailed studies that we have for Tamil Nadu, for West Bengal, now for some of these other markets that I've shared with you, we don't have, equivalently detailed studies for Kerala. But I would say that in Kerala, what you see is a very different dynamic, precisely because you had so many plantation crops. And so there they had commodity boards, right? The decision. And what I have understood is that the hollowing out of the commodity boards has become a problem, right? The amount of support that the state has given to commodity boards at various periods of time has reduced, and that is consequential. So I think some boards perform better than others. Some boards are given, have historically done better, but also over time, I think this weakening of these kinds of commodity boards has been a problem. Secondly, I think Kerala has also now tried to diversify its production. So it was very, paddy centric. There was a lot of dependence. They're trying to grow now vegetables and other things for which they now realize they need to invest in primary marketing systems. During COVID, I think there was some effort and attempt to actually also create local procurement systems, because it's a fairly well decentralized state, for local procurement. So it'll be interesting to see whether Kerala takes its agricultural markets more seriously now, and what those dynamics are going to be as they. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, sufficient information about Kerala is not available. Now, my second question is, my colleague Dr. Ashok Gulati has written several times that APMC's days are over, and the milk farmers do not have any APMC support, and yet they get a fair price. So, is that comparison fair?
Yeah. So I think it's really important, even with milk markets, lots of people are, it's not like all milk farmers do great, right? And places where you actually have strong cooperatives, good infrastructure, good regular buying, farmers do far better. So there's a lot of informalization also, where farmers do not have adequate access, and you don't see as well regulated and well run milk markets. But I think in the case of milk, like with sugarcane, you are seeing a lot of specificity. There's a lot of specificity. Buyers interact with those farmers on a daily basis. There's a lot of face-to-face, one-to-one relationships that are built up in milk. You have something, in terms of assaying and ability to tell quality, that is fairly transparent, even to farmers. Right. The work on cooperatives found very well that, firstly, dairy cooperatives didn't work everywhere. But when you try to do similar things that happened in milk in other commodities, you did not see the same change, whether it was groundnut or cotton in Gujarat and Maharashtra, the same places where you were working relatively well with sugarcane and dairy. So there is a lot of commodity specificity. There is something also very particular when you have highly perishable items that require bulk buying, right? A certain number of buyers only operate in a particular area. They build relationships with the farmers in a certain way, very differently. So the kind of repetitive relationship, whereas in a mundi, in crops, you're selling 2, 3, 4 times a year, right? Twice in major seasons. It's a very different thing. Your relationships are very different. Your credit relationships are very different. Your access is different.
Okay, so buyer-seller relationships are different. Therefore, they cannot really be compared. Okay, understood.
It's not easy to compare, and to just say one deregulated and the other regulated. And actually, even in dairy, there are different perspectives on whether the deregulation and withdrawal of certain kinds of support worked. Okay. I think it's also important to remember that.
Okay, Mekhala, so you should write an article on that. Okay, now let me take the next question from Mr. Sri Harsha Theniru. He's asking, have there been any good studies linking procurement with crop diversification? Because in Telangana, after this new dam came up, a lot of area is now under paddy, and Food Corporation of India is refusing to take paddy because in Telangana, they produce boiled rice, and FCI does not have that much of demand for boiled rice. So is there any study linking procurement with crop diversification?
So the best stories of procurement and crop diversification is Punjab and Haryana in the Green Revolution. They didn't grow this much wheat and paddy before. So if you want to see that what a procurement can do to crops and how well it incentivizes certain kinds of crops, you need to look no further than how we have actually incentivized paddy and wheat, right? So all the evidence that if the government actually goes in and stands in a market and procures and provides assured markets, farmers respond, we can see that from paddy and wheat with abundant evidence. But we can also see it with oilseeds. I gave the example of Madhya Pradesh in the 1970s and 80s. There was an oilseeds mission, national oilseeds mission, a lot of support to soybean. They created oil fed. There were oilseeds cooperatives, some amount of government procurement and a lot of private procurement. Farmers switched to soybean. With the increase in pulse procurement, you start seeing farmers move towards pulses. Now, if you try millet procurement, so there we have good evidence that if government wants to incentivize certain crops, we saw this also happen in Madhya Pradesh with wheat procurement. Production of wheat went up.
Here the difficulty is that the government wants to promote diversification without committing to procurement of oilseeds and pulses on the same scale as paddy and wheat. That is
Correct.
the dimension.
So if you do that, you are really not going to see diversification. What you see is monocropping of a certain kind that then takes hold. And this is a real dynamic, challenge. How do you actually promote diversification? Now, and I just want to make one quick point that there's a difference between crop change and diversification, right? If you want people to grow different crops versus you want them to change what they're growing to other crops, they still may do a monocropping of other crops, but not the crops that they were growing before.
Right.
It's not the same as diversification.
Mekhala, sorry for interrupting you. We have only 5 more minutes and I have many questions.
Yes.
So there is a very relevant and direct question because you have studied Bihar in great detail. During this debate on farm laws, when the farmers' agitation was going on, many people said that by abolishing the mandis, the APMC structure in Bihar, the government of Bihar has benefited the farmers. So what do you think? Of course, it is all there in the report. You may please mention for the audience where to find your report if anybody wants to study, and what did you see in Bihar?
Yeah, so I will put a link right now to, so here, and if you can share it with everyone. Yeah, I hope everyone is able to see it. So in Bihar, I think the story is fairly well now understood, in the sense that, before APMC mandis were abolished, farmers in Bihar sold in the village. They didn't sell. In fact, when Jeffrey Witso went to talk to farmers in Ara district in 2011, which was a good 4-5 years after the mandis had been abolished, farmers didn't even know that the APMC had been abolished. That is because they never entered the mandis in Bihar. The mandis in Bihar had never been created for farmers. They had been created for bilateral trade between commission agents and traders, or aggregators and traders. They were not mandis that were created for farmers to actually enter and engage. So what we found, even, Kargil was buying at that time, just next door, but had a principle not to buy from farmers. They bought from traders. So we also found large companies choosing to continue to buy from large traders in those regions rather than buying from farmers. The abolition of the APMC mandi system did 2 things. It took away some of the smaller traders and intermediaries who had been engaging in the mandi system at that time, and it actually concentrated trade regionally in hands of slightly bigger buyers. In the case of, say, a wheat market. Right, but the major change that has happened in Bihar has been in certain belts with horticultural production, which again didn't go to those mandis in the first place. And what you've seen is smaller market sites come up in different places, which is very common even in Odisha, where you do have a mandi system, but actually farmers trade in smaller markets. And the huge change that has happened with maize in Gulbarga. And in Purnia and in that maize belt. So, that has really been driven by the market. And just like soybean was driven by the market, it wasn't really a regulatory change. It was actually about production and consumption. Bihar has certain advantages with maize markets. It became a very important center. But what you didn't see was a lot of processing of maize.
No, so Mekhala, if APMCs were not abolished in Bihar, do you think Bihar farmers, maize farmers, Aline from NCDX is asking, this question about maize farmers. Do you think they would have got a better price if APMC structure was in place in Bihar?
So the question was, if the APMC structure had been built for primary markets, keeping the requirements of farmers in Bihar in place, I think it could have been, it would have worked and it would have been better. But the question is, how would you do it, right? Now, we tend to have this calculation that every district should have a mandi or every village should have a mandi. In Punjab, mandis are every 5 kilometers. But having mandis in every 5 kilometers will not give you a better price if everything is anyway bought by the state. So anyway, you're all getting MSP. So you don't need it. But if you have a market system, you have to find sites which are also natural markets, right? Where there are enough buyers and enough sellers. So we have been to a number of mandis where the mandi sachiv was scratching his head and saying, how do I get more buyers into this mandi, right? Because the mandi is a market site. You cannot force people to come if it is uneconomical for them to come to that particular market site. So you will have some markets which are thin on competition, some which are dense on competition. And if we take a very state planning view, which is every 5 kilometers you need a mandi, or every 25 kilometers you need a mandi, rather than looking at what are the kinds of access points, where will, are you closer to warehouses and storage locations? Are you closer to rake points and actually moving the commodity? Are you close to consumption sites? Okay. Those kinds of things. So I think if you need a new imagination, which is why diversity is important, right? Wow. I think Bihar, Odisha, all could do with regulated markets, but the imagination cannot be of mandis in Punjab or in Madhya Pradesh.
Okay, fine. Okay, so we are coming to the end of it. It has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure the audience would like to have more of it. But if there is a demand, maybe we will have another session with you. I know that this is a subject in which everybody who is interested in agriculture is keen to know more about the functioning of markets. Even I had many more questions, but we have run out of time. So thank you very much. In this series, we have a rule that we do not exceed 1 hour. So that does a good purpose of, serves a good purpose of retaining audience's interest and maybe persuading them to join for the next lecture in the series. So thank you very much, Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy, and thank you very much, audience on YouTube, audience on Zoom. I know that many friends have joined on YouTube also. Mr. Dilip Chenoy from FICCI is also there. So thank you very much, Mr. Chenoy, and thank you, IIC, for hosting this series. Goodbye, Mekhala, and goodbye, audience.
Thank you so much.